And welcome again, brethren and sisters and young people. The next two classes are a reply to the gross misrepresentations of God's just, holy and good law. It's no surprise that the Bible is ignored or mocked in the last days in which we live. We know the Bible said there would be attitudes of madness working miracles in the earth, that's radically changing human thinking, bringing the world to Armageddon. That was the prophecy of Revelation 16, and of course the next verse is our call to judgment. Timothy said men would be lovers of their own selves and despisers of those that are good. The days of Noah, desertion from the way of truth, violence, evil imaginations and widespread corruption. The days of Lot, defiant immorality, pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness. People ignorant and misinformed about God. And very sadly, people so full of themselves that they think that they can judge God by their own values. And the Bible's clear that there is a thinking of the wicked. The wicked boasts of the desires of their soul. The one greedy for gain or popularity curses and renounces Yahweh. In the pride of their face, the wicked does not seek him. Their thoughts are, there is no God. And we're going to talk about how the anti-religion industry has taken to abusing and blaspheming the God of Israel, whom we serve. The leaders of this particular charge are led by four men that the media has glorified as the Four Horsemen. Christopher Hitchens, now dead, Dave Dennett, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. They've stolen from the Apocalypse the image of the Four Horsemen because they believe they have inflicted devastation upon religion and godly values. They've written millions of books that have had tremendous sales throughout the world. They post on YouTube, they post on all forms of social media. And you might not have read their books. You might not have even heard of these guys. But you have witnessed their impact on society in the last 20 years. And we're now witnessing the impact of that on the brotherhood. They have promoted Bible ignorance. They have promoted the loss of Christian ethics in society. God is challenged, rejected and judged by their values. Religion has been on retreat from the Four Horsemen. And sadly, we have lost too many of our young people because their doctrines, their blasphemy has found root in the minds of men today. They have taken away faith from the earth. And so we have these wave of anti-religion books. And their ideas have been promoted by the media, taken up by academia, become the political language, the woke speak that is out there today. And what is left in the Western world is a biblically ignorant population, where people imagine they think they understand what the Bible says. Or as one quote says, the Bible told me so. The vibes people think are there are not exactly what is going on when you read the Bible for yourself. And the leading skeptic is a man called Richard Dawkins. Atheist, well known, and he's very dangerous. His bestseller was a book called The God Delusion. It targets God's law particularly, and it targets the Old Testament specifically and how God revealed himself to Israel. And he makes a mockery of the God of the Bible. Where it leads people is to believing there's probably no God, so go out and enjoy yourself. Stop worrying and enjoy your life. And that's the bus he drives around the UK, promoting the God delusion. You can be whatever you want to be because there's no judgment, there's no afterlife, there's no God to account to. And as I said, we're here to answer the charge that he made in his book, The God Delusion, about the God of the Old Testament. The most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, misogynistic, homophobic, all the labels are there, racist, infanticidal, some of them I can't even pronounce. A moral monster. That's how they portray the God that we love. What a wicked construction that is to talk about the Creator like that. And he concludes with this thing that God is a moral monster. The others are just as vitriolic. Christopher Hitchens, You know, when he was asked on his deathbed, because he died of throat cancer, do you regret your attack on religion and God? And he said, the only thing I regret is that my great knowledge is going to be lost to the world. God has all these unalterable laws, he said. The forgotten Canaanites were pitilessly driven out of their homes to make room for the ungrateful and mutinous children of Israel. Sounds a bit like commentary on the Middle East today, doesn't it? Moreover, the Old Testament contains a warrant for trafficking in humans, ethnic cleansing, slavery, bride price, indiscriminate massacre. We're not bound by any of it because it was put together by crude, uncultured human animals. Pretty stern stuff, isn't it? Sam Harris. My book is designed to demolish the intellectual and moral pretensions of Christianity in its most committed forms. If the Bible is true, we should be stoning people for heresy, adultery, homosexuality, worshipping graven images, and other imaginary crimes. So let's just summarise what they're on about. They deny the existence of God and they support evolution, so they're all evolutionists. They proclaim that religion is the major cause of evil throughout history, and they give you great accounts of how religions have been behind so many wars that we see in the world. They insult God as a disgraceful, bullying child abuser. And here's taking a little boy up and putting him on the altar and traumatising him. Forgetting, of course, that Isaac was probably 33 when that happened and Abraham was 133. And he went together with his father to the Mount of Sacrifice. They give people the justification to follow their own lusts, and that's what they're all about. So this is the issues we have to deal with. Is God a jealous God who allows no other gods? Is he a God who demands constant praise and worship? Is he a God who is repressive and discriminatory about women and approves the sale of daughters as brides? Did he mercifully create genocide for the Canaanites and the Amalekites? Did he condone slavery? Was he racist? And they say he was, because he chose just one nation of all the peoples on the earth. What about the harsh punishments for gathering sticks on the Sabbath? What about the death penalty for adultery and homosexuals? That doesn't go down well today. And they say that God's morals are out of date today. And we need to have some answers to this, brethren and sisters, because your children, when they get involved with social media, the internet, Facebook, Google, they will come across these opinions. They will come across these examples. We all need to have a scriptural example to actually say, this is how you properly should answer these questions. Let's never lose sight of this one fact. We will never be in harmony with a corrupt world. We will never agree with the postmodern age on everything. There have been some great advances. The way disability is treated has been a great advance in our society. There have been many oppressions of women that have been corrected. But we will never agree where society wants to take us down the path of absolute equality. We need to have an answer to these things. And this is why. And many of you know who wrote these words. When a brother of 30 years, who taught at Bible schools in this country, can write like this, that he no longer believes in God because God is not who I once thought he was. And I ask the question, did God change? Who's got the problem? Of the Bible, he said, there was some wisdom there, but the attitudes to women and foreigners it described, sometimes commands, were not worthy of the God I once believed in. Well, it was always there in the Bible. Who's changed? Who's now judging God against modern values that actually keep changing every week to some new value, some new woke understanding of what you're supposed to believe? And they judge God in a very, very wrong way. Well, let's just remember to get the law in its right context. It was a national law written against the background of existing ancient cultures and moral codes. So there were moral codes around in the time that the law of Moses was given, and it had to fit amongst those moral codes. It was a nation of rescued slaves. They lacked initiative. They'd never had any chance to govern themselves before this. They needed strict rules and moral civil law to define their forms of worship. And their law was so different to the existing nations. You go to the code of Hammurabi, you go to the code of the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greeks, there was torture, there was mutilation, there was slavery, there was class distinctions, witchcraft, and no respect for women, no property rights for women. And so we find that God gave them a just and holy and a good law. But in that, he regulated things that he didn't approve of, but he knew would happen, and he therefore said, when this happens, I don't want it to happen, but when it happens, these are the rules. He didn't want people to thieve, did he? But he said, if you thieve, these are the rules. Same with the divorce laws. There was regulations around what God did not want to happen. And we can come at the Old Testament, we can actually see through the lens of the New Testament what God was trying to teach his people. So, let's answer some of the questions. Does God demand soul worship? Yes, he does. Can't get away from it. Yahweh your God is one. You shall love him with all your heart, with all your soul. Him only shalt thou serve. Can't serve graven images, can't serve any other gods. Absolutely clear, God is jealous and he's demanding. Is he a jealous God? Yes, he is. You shall worship no other God, for Yahweh, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Guilty. God is a jealous God. God will not share his affections with others. For Yahweh thy God is a consuming fire, even a jealous God, says Deuteronomy. You shall not bow down to idols, nor serve them, for Yahweh thy God, I am a jealous God, he says. You can't miss what God is saying. He does require wholehearted, sincere, and unified worship of him alone. So if that's a problem with the current world, then we have to say that's a problem. But it's not a problem for us, because that's the God we serve. He's still a jealous God. You go to the New Testament, shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? You can't take of the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. God doesn't share our affections with other gods. So if that's a problem, then God certainly is a jealous God. The world is the one that's got the problem. He's got a racist by choosing Israel as the one chosen people. Yes, he did choose Israel above all nations. He did show his power and glory and keep his promises to Abraham. He wanted Israel to be his witness to the world. He says, I've chosen you that you might show the world my virtues. And the day is coming when God will bless all nations. But for now, he's working with Israel. God hath not cast away his people that he foreknew. And in the future, 10 men will take hold of the skirt of a Jew in the kingdom, going up to Zion and say, we will go with you because Yahweh is with you. And even in the kingdom, they will recognize that that is God's chosen people. And not because God is racist. God has the prerogative to choose whom he wants to choose. He chose one man and his wife alone in Abraham and Sarah. He's chosen one nation to be his witness to the world. You are my witnesses, says God. And God will, in the kingdom, elevate the children of Israel to be the microcosm of what can be achieved if you serve God with your whole heart and mind. So God is certainly a God that chooses for his own. But notice God reminded them that it was a very great privilege. And you shall not walk in the manners of the nations which are cast out before you. For they committed all these things, and therefore I abhorred them. But I've said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess it, a land that floweth with milk and honey. I, Yahweh your God, which have separated you from other people. And you shall be holy unto me, for Yahweh, I, Yahweh, am holy, and you have severed you from other people, that you should be mine, says God. Incredibly definite that God chooses one particular people. Are we surprised that today, amidst all those who profess to be Christians, that God says there's a narrow way that leads to life, there's a little flock. There are first fruits that are selected by virtue of accepting God's truth. To choose, to separate, to sever people from the rest of the population is God's prerogative and something we're incredibly thankful for. He chooses the insignificant to confound the mighty and the powerful of this world. And the filter is the one saving truth that you find in his Bible. So on those accounts, jealous, demanding, racist, as the world would define it, God says, my prerogative is to do as I choose. Who are you to question me? What about the genocide of the Canaanites? Well, let's not forget, brethren and sisters, that when you read Genesis chapter 6 to 8, God obliterated the whole population of the world in the days of Noah. Men, women, children. Estimated 2 billion people perished in the flood. God did that because the world was full of evil imaginations, corruption and violence. And he wiped the slate and got rid of all of them. That was God's prerogative. And God said to Abraham, when the iniquity of the Canaanites is full, you shall inherit their land. They will be displaced. And God gave them another 440 years to repent. And if you've done any study on what the Canaanite religion was about at the time that Israel arrived, you will understand why God said, my patience has run out. It was corrupt, depraved and immoral. They had things like Molech, Baal Peor, and all those horrible things where they sacrificed their children, where they corrupted their children at a very young age. And God said, I want you to wipe out every trace of those Canaanites, men, women, children. Every one of their altars and their worships and their priests has to be exterminated, that you might not be corrupted with such things. And God was very clear on that they had to annihilate the Canaanites. And why did God do that? Deuteronomy 9 verse 5 and 6. Not because of your righteousness, Israel, or the uprightness of your heart, Israel, that you're going to possess this land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, Yahweh your God is driving them out from before you, that he may confirm the word that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac and to Jacob. God is giving you this land to possess, not because of your righteousness, but you are a stubborn people. So Hitchens was right when he said that God drove out the Canaanites to give it to a stubborn people. God recognised that was the case, but that was his prerogative. He wanted that nation to be different to the Canaanites. It was not good to have Canaanites living amongst them. And we all know the problems that caused in the days of the judges. And so God said, drive them out, destroy them. And God did require Israel to exterminate the Canaanites and their vile religion. No exceptions allowed, because many of the children were corrupted at a very young age. But other nations who were further away from the land of Canaan, if they submitted to Israel and remained at peace, Israel would leave them alone. And God never required Israel to go out and to conquer nations for the purpose of territorial gain or for spoil. He never said go out and conquer those, unless they were directly threatening the nation. So God did promote war, that the nation might be established and preserved from the evils of the Canaanites around about them. But it was limited to them taking the land that he promised to Abraham. Later on, of course, he said, you've got to wipe out the Amalekites as well, because they were both a moral and a physical threat to the nation of Israel. And when Saul failed to do that and brought back Agag, Samuel showed clearly what the mind of God was. You do not compromise with the Canaanites and the Amalekites. Now, that's the God of the Bible. If we're finding that difficult to swallow, then maybe the modern world's got to us more than we would like to think. We've got to be in harmony with the God of the Bible that has the prerogative to make these choices and to require Israel to get rid of the Canaanites. Because if we don't, are you going to enjoy going out at the start of the kingdom and getting rid of the wicked? I'd like you to come to Psalm 58, to a verse which reminds us of our future responsibilities in cleaning up this earth in which we live. Psalm 58, verse 10 and 11. The righteous shall rejoice when he seeth the vengeance. He shall wash his feet in the blood of the wicked. So the man will say, there is a reward for the righteous. Verily there is a God that judges in the earth. Make a note of Psalm 149, make a note of Isaiah 66, verse 23 to 24, you'll find the same sentiment. The initial work of the saints will be to remove evil from the face of the earth. And we will have that responsibility. We'll have to eliminate the wicked. Thou shalt consider the place of the wicked, says Psalm 37. It shall not be. Proverbs 2, verse 22 says, transgressors shall be rooted out of the earth. That will be part of the task of the saints who actually see things as God sees it. We won't enjoy bringing destruction upon anybody. But to remove the wicked, there has to be some destruction. And we'll work with God to eliminate that sort of corruption from the earth. And again, if you find that uncomfortable, you need to think about the God that the Bible reveals to us. That's what God says is going to happen. It'll happen with or without us being on board. Let's move now to the topic of slavery. This is one of the main weapons of the Dawkins movement and the others. They say that God approved slavery. And of course, they're talking about the slavery of the American kind, where people were transported, where Arabs and Africans rounded up their kinsmen in Africa, put them in chains, brought them down to the coast, put them on British, Dutch and French ships that were vile transports. There was hardly room to move, no sanitation, almost no food, a bit of water, and transported them across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States, the British West Indies for the sugar plantations, and it was an immoral, cruel slave trade. They often killed those that they didn't want to take as they regarded them unfit for work. They burned the villages when they took away the men and the women who were fit. It was a horrible trade. And incredibly, Christians in England and America justified the concept of slavery using passages from the Bible. They justified the vile transports, the branding of slaves, the mutilation of slaves, the auctions of slaves, the splitting up of families, the sexual slavery of the women, the whips, the chains and the dogs and the bounty hunters. You probably know the story of Roots, where those who ran away and were caught had their toes cut off so they couldn't run away again. And people used the Bible to justify that. What a shame it was on the Christian world of that time, but it was profitable. That's where the great wealth came from, the cotton industry in the south and the rich sugar plantations in the West Indies on the backs of slaves. But you see, that's not what the Bible said. That's what the Bible said about slavery, because slavery was around the time of the children of Israel. They had been slaves in Egypt. They weren't paid. They could be sold. But slavery of the cruel, hopeless kind that we saw in the 1800s and earlier was totally banned under God's law. And for the first time ever in any code of any nation, anywhere in the world, slaves were treated as people and not property. And the death penalty applied for anyone who bought or sold forced slaves. Now notice that word, forced slaves. You're going to see there was one particular group of people in Israel who were bought, but they were not forced slaves. And that's what the Bible says in Exodus 21. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. I wonder what the slave traders made of that. You see, it was a death penalty to steal a man and to sell him as a slave. And there were basic rules laid down by God that excluded slavery of that form completely. No kidnapping, no forced slavery. If a man be found stealing any of his brethren of the children of Israel and maketh merchandise of him or selleth him, then that thief shall die. I shall put away evil from among you. You know, God gave so many laws that said servants, and I'm making a very distinction there between servants and slaves, but servants could not be harmed or treated violently. You could not mutilate anyone else under God's law. No branding was ever allowed. Runaways from other nations must not be hunted down and could not be returned to their masters. Somebody turned up from Moab and had run away from his master. You had to look after him, feed him, give him a job. You could not send him back for a bounty. You know, all of God's provisions were totally against the slavery of the American style. And we need to understand, when the law of Moses was written, there were 3 types of servitude. And the word is very different. The Bible does not use the term slavery, it talks about servitude. But there were 3 different classes who were treated differently for good reasons. Number 1, there were the Hebrew brethren who got into debt, or maybe they'd incurred a fine that they couldn't pay. They were committed to work for a limited time. At the end of 7 years, whatever the debt was not worked off would be forgiven. Inheritances could be sold or mortgaged, but only in cases of extreme poverty. They worked as a servant to the person holding the mortgage who'd paid off their debts until the year of Jubilee. Then they went back and they resumed their inheritance. So Hebrews would serve because they were in debt or they had mortgaged their inheritance. So it was service to another Hebrew, Hebrew to Hebrew. So that's the first category. There were foreigners from outside of Canaan. Now, let's say they went across and they went into Syria and they conquered a city in Syria. What would they do with the men of war that were survived? They could put them all to death, let them roam free, or they could say, you come back to Israel and work as servants for us, then you can have your life spared. There were exiles from other countries that left their countries, probably, again, running away from evil masters or from war, and come into Israel. They couldn't own Jewish land because it had all been inherited by the Jews. You couldn't buy someone's inheritance. So they had to choose to work in Israel to keep their families alive or themselves alive. So there were foreigners who chose to work in Israel. No one could make them stay. They chose to work there. Then there was foreign servants who were actually bought from Gentiles. So this is quite a different group. These are people who might have had special skills. So you would go across perhaps to Egypt and say, look, I need somebody that's very good at making wheels. And you'd get a wheelwright from Egypt, you would buy him from the person who currently had him as a slave, and you'd bring him back to Israel and say, right, I need you to work here for me. But because in Israel they had to follow all the provisions of the law of Moses, of how well these people had to be treated, the conditions and the protections in Israel were far better than every other nation of the ancient world. So we have these people who are foreign servants. 3 categories of servitude in Israel. Now, let's ask, why did servitude occur? Come to Deuteronomy chapter 15. In Deuteronomy 15, we have a verse that the Lord Jesus Christ quotes. In Deuteronomy chapter 15, and it says there in let's read from verse 3. Of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again, but that which is in thy brother's hand shall be released. This is the law of release here at the end of 7 years. And look in verse 4. Save when there shall be no poor among you, for Yahweh shall greatly bless thee in the land which Yahweh thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it. Now, there never will be a time when there will be no poor in the land. If you've got an AV margin that says, to the end that there shall be no poor among you. And that's more accurate. So why did God allow servitude? Well, the idea was that it would be an abolition of poverty. At the end of every 7 years, all the remaining debt was forgiven. You think about that. There was always a new start. The maximum you could work to pay off your debts was 7 years. So the end was to get rid of poverty. The poor you have with you always. So God's holy law did everything to allay poverty. There was fair tithing, so an equal taxation system. There was a welfare system for the poor, the strangers, the widows and the fatherless. There was the security of inheritances, so every family owned farming land. There was the encouragement of generosity for other people. But you can give people all those equal things, and they differ in enterprise, they differ in initiative, they differ in ability to actually manage their inheritance. And some make bad decisions. Sometimes ill health might strike a family that puts them into poverty. Somebody might die early. The crops might fail because they didn't plant them properly or at the right time. Some just can't handle money. And some had fines to work off. So you see, there were many reasons why there was the poor in the land, and there will always be people who don't manage affairs very well. So God provided. He provided that they would go into servitude, but it was never slavery. You see, slaves never get paid anything. These people were serving to pay off their debts that they had incurred, either by crime or by perhaps poor management or by misfortune. But it was working for the debt that you were paying off. And in the meantime, you were supported by the employer. He provided everything you needed. So it says, if thy brother that dwelleth by thee be waxen poor and be sold unto thee, you shall not compel him to serve as a bondservant. He's not the same as a slave you might have bought from another country. He's your brother. You've got to treat him as a hired servant, as an employee. As a sojourner he shall be with thee, and shall serve thee unto the year of Jubilee. This is to do with the law of Jubilee. Then shall he depart from thee, both he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family, to the possession of his inheritance shall he go. For they are my servants, says God, that I brought out of Egypt. They shall not be sold as bondmen. I want you to come to Leviticus 25. Let's look at this law, because there's a word that pops up here which God says makes it so different to the slavery of the Americas. Leviticus 25, and God says in verse 39, and thy brother that is dwelleth by thee be waxen poor and be sold unto thee. And sold is not a very good translation. It means that it's now in your employ. He shall not compel him to serve as a bondservant. He's not a slave. He's your brother who's in poverty that you're helping out. And you're looking after him. He shall be as a hired servant, a sojourner. He shall be with thee. Okay? Then we come down to verse 43. You shall not rule over him with rigour, but shall fear thy God. And it's again there again in verse 46 and at the end of verse 53. Not rule over him with rigour, which means no whips, no beatings, no knocking his teeth out. Any abuse of that servant, any abuse of that Hebrew brother, he can walk out of the door and his debt is totally forgiven. And the Bible was clear about that. No rigour was allowed because he's your brother in poverty. You see how wonderful this law was and how different it was to the codes of the ancient world. And might I say, slavery is alive and well in the world today. People are still being kidnapped in Africa, in Asia, and taken to Middle East countries as slaves. It's happening today in our enlightened world. So did God allow slavery for Hebrews? No. Servitude in Israel happened because a man got into debt, incurred a fine by crime, and had to work the debt off. The debtor was free to remain of the debt at the year of release. He could resume his farming, his own inheritance. And we'll talk on Sunday about what would happen when he went out. They had to be treated well or the debt was cancelled and they could walk away. So the law was very clear. Look after them, that's your brother. Unique laws, and this is some of the things that were unique about the servitude of Hebrews. They could not be beaten, they could not be harmed. The maximum term was 6 years, cancelled in the 7th. They were sent away with lots of goodies. You know, when the time came for the year of release and you had to send him away, this brother's been away from his farm, could be for 6 years. What's he going to survive on until his crops come good? What's he going to survive on until his herds are built up again? Well, Deuteronomy is very clear. You say to him, go into the barn, load up your wagon, go into my herd, take the best of my herd with you. Make sure you've got enough to get through the next year. you might have to cough up more than he actually earned off in 6 years. And there was no limitation to what he could take. And God says you're not to be tight-fisted with him. You've got to open your hand wide and say, look, take it, take it. And we'll talk on Sunday why you could do that with a smile on your face. And when inheritances were sold, they had to be treated well, not oppressed or overworked. No rigour was allowed. Sorry. Wrong button. So, was it slavery or servitude? Some of the things that make God's law so different. You know, servants were included in the family worship. Go through the law of Moses, you'll see it over and over again. You, your servant, your maidservant are to get involved in the family worship. All Hebrews were to worship whether they were in service or whether they were masters. They all had the Sabbath day off. They could marry others in the master's house. So you might be working there and you see another person also working for that master and you decide to get married. You could do that. They could elect to stay with their master at the end of their term. And the fact that this actually happened shows what a good and loving relationship was built up between the two. And the man would say, I love my master, I want to stay here. I'm better off working for somebody else, because there are people who unfortunately are better off working for someone else. They just can't run a farm or a business. They just don't have the ability to do it. And they choose to stay. And you know what happened when they chose to stay? A public declaration was made so that the employer could not be accused of slavery. He couldn't be accused of keeping this man against his will, because you had to line up your ear to the doorpost and have it drilled to the doorpost. That's a painful process. Everybody could see that you were willingly committing to stay and serve that master. And back home, if you didn't come home to resume your inheritance, your family, your tribe would take it over and divide it amongst themselves, so the unity of the tribe would be preserved. Think about the special care for maidservants. A beautiful study to just go through the law of Moses and look how often God mentions maidservants, because of all the people in service, this is the most vulnerable one. You all know what happens in many Arab countries, other places where teenage girls are slaves. And God makes constant provision to protect the vulnerable maidservants. They could not be mistreated, they could not be harmed. They were not to be lusted after. They were specifically included in all the feasts and family worship. When you go up this one, take your maidservant with you. When you keep the Sabbath, make sure your maidservant keeps the Sabbath. And the laws of release included women, so they got the same treatment when they left under the laws of release. And we'll talk tomorrow about the other case of what the skeptics call the bride price, Exodus 21. Those who had married into the house of the creditor, of course, they stayed there under certain conditions. So there was a very special care for maidservants. What about these foreign servants? Well, in cruel ancient times, captives in war were normally killed, or they became unpaid slaves with no rights. You know, they were carted off like the Jews were in AD 70 and became slaves all over the world. But becoming bond servants in Israel, they came under the good laws that God had provided for servitude. Much better than dying of starvation because all your crops are gone and your city's gone because you lost the war. Canaanites, of course, had to be exterminated. But those distant nations could join Israel as servants, as the Gibeonites did, by deception. And they became the carriers of wood and water, but they survived. And they went on, of course, to convert to Judaism and became, we believe, the Nethinims that went right down to the time of the captivity. All servants had to be well treated, and they could join Israel's religion. You know, that's very different to the American slavery, isn't it? And then we come to the case of foreign servants. And the Jews could go to other nations and buy people with particular skills, and they came as willing immigrants into Israel. They couldn't own land, they had to work for a living. Runaway slaves had to be protected and never sent back. What a difference to the bounty hunters. Again, mistreated servants of any kind could go free. So you wanted to keep people working for you, it's wise to treat them nicely. The principle always was, God said, remember, you were slaves in Egypt. Remember that in the way you treat other people. And you and I can draw the spiritual lesson, brethren and sisters. Whenever we feel superior, whenever we feel that we can control other people, always remember that God says, you were slaves in darkness and bondage, and I've released you. What about these non-Jewish workers? The ones that were bought in and were now regarded as the property of the owner. And there's no doubt about it. They were the property of the owner. We know that because if you accidentally killed one of them, you had to cough up compensation for the loss. So let's say I brought in this wheel maker from Egypt to make wagons for me, and then your bullock comes across and kills him, then you've got to pay me back for my loss because I paid for that man. So he was property. But I can't on-sell him. I can't say, look, you know, I've made enough wheels, you can go, I'm going to sell you to the guy. You can't do that. So once you've bought him, you've got to keep him. And all the laws about fair treatment apply to him as well as a Hebrew brother. So again, life was much better than working in other countries. Again, very, very good laws. And God said, I want you to think about strangers. Any stranger that comes to Israel, he shall dwell with thee among you. If he chooses to live anywhere in the land, that's his choice. You shall not oppress him. When a stranger sojourns with you, you shall not do him wrong. Treat him with you and love him as yourself. See the echo of Jesus in that? Do unto others as you would be treated yourself. That's the law of Christ, isn't it? Because you were strangers in Egypt. So you see, that's remembering, isn't it, what we've come from. So strangers had to be carefully looked after. So what about slavery in the New Testament? We know there were brethren who were masters and slaves in the ecclesia. Philemon and Onesimus being the classic example. But you see, Jesus Christ, when he came, was about individual salvation. He did not come on his first advent to change the ungodly nations from their evil practices. He didn't rail against Rome and their slavery and oppression they brought upon the world. He didn't rail against Pilate, killing people needlessly. It wasn't the time for Christ to assert God's righteousness yet. His goal was the transformation of individuals, not the transformation of society. He didn't comment upon slavery, even though it was a great evil in the world. It was a reality of the Roman world that there were slaves everywhere. And brethren and sisters had to work around it. They had to live the truth best as they could, both as slaves and masters of slaves. But look at the pressure that was put upon Philemon when Onesimus was returned as a brother. And Paul said, I know you will do more than I ask. All he was asking was that Onesimus not be punished for running away. But he reminded Philemon that you and Onesimus are going to share eternity together. I know you will do more than I ask. What a hint that was. A truly spiritual person would release converted slaves and probably the others as well. Let's talk about one aspect of slavery and working off debts that we just need to cover in a little more detail. And that is the matter of inheritances, because, you know, debts were forgiven at the end of 7 years. When it came to inheritances, of course, it was the Jubilee, which was every 50 years. The overriding principle was this. You could mortgage your property. Let's say you got into serious debt through mismanagement, ill health, or something that happened in your inheritance. You could say to somebody who had the money, look, you pay off my debts, get me out of trouble, and I will work for you until the year of Jubilee. And of course, the amount of that loan would depend upon how many years it was to the year of Jubilee. But you couldn't sell your land forever. You could mortgage it. And you could work for the lender. The principle was, as Yahweh said in Leviticus 25, the land shall not be sold forever. The land is mine, and you are strangers and sojourners with me. So God was the ultimate owner of the land. But God says, you got a house in the city, I don't want it. I don't like cities. You can sell a house in the city, I don't care about it, but you can't sell your farm. Which is what Naboth said to Ahab, wasn't it? Hebrews were only allowed to mortgage the land in cases of extreme poverty. Mortgaged land always reverted in the year of Jubilee. And the buyer paid a price based on the years that were left. And the owner worked as a paid servant to pay off his debts. But God encouraged redemption. And in Leviticus 25, when you just go through these verses, God encouraged redemption. Look at verse 35. If they rather be waxen poor, you shall relieve him. Right? His hands failed. He just can't keep going. You shall relieve him. Even the stranger and sojourner has got to be relieved. There's got to be care for this person who's got into debt. So God's intention always that I want you to redeem things. In verse 49, when one of your relatives is in trouble and he sold his inheritance, his family can redeem him. They can pay off the debt. But God said this, at the very least, in verse 53, if you can't buy out the debt, then make sure that he's not treated with rigour. Excuse me. So, brethren and sisters, God is not a moral monster. He chose Israel. He gave them wise laws. He encouraged spiritual thinking, compassion, and kindness. What a tragedy. Men today are so ill-informed about the wonderful God of Israel. Let us make sure that when these charges are made, that we can offer a reasoned scriptural reply and not be led down the path of scepticism, atheism, and the blasphemy that these men have committed. We love the God of Israel. We love his laws. It is a holy, just, and a good law. And he's a wonderful moral God. Let us serve him while we can.